Back to Level Up Test Prep. Today we're going to go over a kind of summary answer of how to respond to the following prompt. Evaluate the extent to which the Black Civil Rights Movement was successful between 1945 to 1974. So let's examine this question. Whenever you see the phrase, evaluate the extent, I want you to think of a barometer like I mentioned in my last video. Was it 0% successful, 50% successful, 100% successful, maybe somewhere in the middle, 75, 25. If you remember the last video, you know the answer is never 0 and it's never 100. The answer is always somewhere in between, and that's what makes it a good historical question. So, we want to know, how successful was the Black Civil Rights Movement right after World War II to about the end of Richard Nixon's presidency. Now, there's a ton of answers here, but just for time purposes, I'm going to limit them to 6, but I can redo this question with a new round of plausible answers. Here I have the success bias versus the failure bias. So if we think it's the success bias, we believe it's on this side, 50%, 75% successful, up to 100%. The failure bias would be the other end, meaning it didn't accomplish much. And that could be true of how successful was the New Deal, how successful were the anti-war movements in the second half of the 20th century. The question could be repurposed for any time period or historical circumstance. Now here I have the success or the optimism bias, so you want to walk in with an optimistic view, or you could have the failure or pessimism bias saying, generally speaking, on net, it wasn't that positive. So the short answer, if I can just front load you an answer here, the success really comes from political and legal gains, let's fix that up. The failures, or the lack of success, largely came from not being able to match their white counterparts on economic terms, and social acceptance. So people weren't really going to change what was in their hearts in a short period of time. Another case to be made for the failures is people try to thwart the political and legal gains. And there's all types of ways that you can do that, and we're going to go over those answers. So thwart political gains. So what makes the Civil Rights Movement successful? How could I argue that? Well, of course, there's the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but we're actually not going to start there because the question does say 1945, and it wants us to know how successful it became. So I'm actually going to start with Truman's desegregation of the military. In 1948. So it's a slow start. It's small, but it's going to kind of shape the trajectory. What's another answer I could cite in my response? I could bring up Eisenhower, Executive Order 1073-0, which sent troops to Arkansas to help integration, or I should say desegregation. This, of course, is the Little Rock Nine, famous story. It's most likely been cited in your textbook. So here you're seeing presidential efforts to help facilitate the civil rights movement, but it's simply not the sweeping legislation that you'll see in Congress in the mid-60s. And that's one of the points you would have to make in an essay, is that it started off kind of weak, small, minor efforts here and there, the larger pieces of legislation actually didn't take place until later. You could always, of course, cite the Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board, which is how Eisenhower got to that. But since I already mentioned school integration, I'm actually not going to drop that in. I'd actually like to drop a U.S. Commission on Civil Rights report of 1968. This is after the laws have been signed. And what did this show? It showed a pretty solid increase in black voter turnout. One example would be Alabama. Went from 19.3 prior to the Civil Rights Law to 51.6, all in about a decade or so. Next stop. I could cite a census report. Now this one is very extensive. It was published in 1978, but the data refers to the time period in our question. So the census report made a lot of claims about the black social, political, and economic life from actually 1790 to 1970s. And in that, I can just drop a quick quote. Because when you're evaluating the extent, it's not enough just to say what laws were passed. You want to look at the black community holistically and look at social gains, economic gains, civil rights gains are of course important, but we could also look at educational gains, home ownership, wages. There's actually a lot of things we can look for to see how successful the civil rights movement was, because it was a holistic movement in and of itself. So in 1940, I'm actually going to drop the full quote just to shorthand it. So in 1940, black Americans only made up 6% of white-collar jobs, but by 1970, they made up 24%. So pretty solid increase. Now the question is, is this enough to say they were successful? I mean, should it be 50? Should it be 60? But at least we can say, major progress was made in this time period that we're referring to in the question. On the abstract, was it enough? That's a separate question. And we can also cite the LBJ, because I want to cite several presidents here. So Truman could be cited, Eisenhower can be cited, JFK could be cited, LBJ could be cited, Nixon can be cited. So we all have to look at how did they advance or not advance the civil rights movement. So LBJ signed the Great Society programs, which he explicitly said was to help close the gaps. Explicitly stated were to close the gaps. And last but not least, I can cite Richard Nixon, who hired a Philadelphia union because of their compliance with affirmative action laws. So these are all plausible answers in arguing that the civil rights movement was a success on the political and legal grounds. Desegregation in the military, federal backing of integration in the school system, voter turnout went up, the number of white-collar jobs went up, the Great Society programs were signed into law to help close the gaps, and Nixon, a Republican, mind you, was now even hiring unions based on their compliance with affirmative action laws. Again, there are almost a few dozen more answers I could think of right off the top of my head, but we're going to keep it short for time here. So this is how I would argue this if I followed the optimism bias or I wanted to argue the positives. Now, what about the failures or the shortcomings, or what I would just call the pessimism bias? One document I could cite was something called the Moynihan Report. Okay, I apologize for the spelling, but that was in 1965. And just to summarize, he called racism a virus in the American bloodstream, and said black people, unfortunately, will have to expect more discrimination for another generation. So, another generation of discrimination. Again, he said this, in the tone of the report. He was upset about this, but was trying to diagnose where the black community was and how they could move forward. And this again ties back into the social acceptance argument, saying that the civil rights movement just could not convince tens of millions of Americans to change what was in their hearts. Perhaps one could say that white Americans were okay with the civil rights laws, but the social acceptance just was not there yet, because they knew integration would more directly affect them as opposed to voting, which was kind of seemed more far away, or just a constitutional right. Okay, there's also, and since I made mention of the school integration, I would like to say that there was a lot of opposition to integration. We have the governor of Georgia, Governor Maddox of Georgia, in 1969, opposing school integration on the grounds of freedom of choice. And that's in the congressional records as well. And he was not alone. Several other governors opposed integration in the 1950s, 60s, and even into the 70s. On the more local level, you would see opposition to forced busing and just general harassment. Now, I cited LBJ on the optimism side. I'd actually like to cite him on the pessimism side as well. So LBJ signed the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act. This increased policing in black neighborhoods and caused or increased police brutality. I don't know what is up with my thing right now. Police brutality. And general harassment, which continued on for decades. Number 4, since I cited President Nixon on the optimism side, I'd like to cite him on the pessimism side. Nixon signed the DA into existence, or I should say created through an executive order, which led to a war on drugs, which largely had a greater impact on black Americans than other groups, and led to mass incarceration, and ultimately would lead to tough on crime policies, but we're going to leave it there. All right. And I should have mentioned this earlier. I apologize. So the Southern Manifesto could also be evidence of a pessimism bias, because the Southern Manifesto of 1956 united the South against integration efforts. And this was done like just right after Brown v. Board. It was in response to that. And last but not least, I'd actually like to cite that same census report from 1978 and show you that they had, mixed results ultimately. So, same census report, 1978, stated however, in 19 However, in 1978, the 25.4 million blacks in this country remained far behind whites in almost every social and economic area. So that is a direct quote, and it's literally the same report as this one. So there you have it. This question is designed to kind of be on a barometer, and to analyze the civil rights movement: social, political, economic, legal. Where did they succeed? Greatly, mildly, moderately? Where were the shortcomings? Where were the failures, perhaps blind spots? And just to refer back to the original kind of shorthanded answer, so they made a lot of gains on the political and legal grounds. However, some of them were thwarted through later efforts, and they lagged behind on economic and social terms, and social acceptance would still be a factor. And you can say that's where you could argue the failure or pessimism bias perspective, and you have surely enough historical evidence to argue that it was positive or generally positive or mostly successful, and you still have evidence to say that it was not fully or completely successful. Like I said, the answer would never be 100, and it will never be 0. Thanks for leveling up with me. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.